Do you believe that in pre-colonial Southeast Asia, ideas of love and intimacy may have been more diverse than we usually imagine? Some early accounts describe kings who kept male companions within their courts. In certain island societies, rituals mention partnerships that did not follow the male-female pattern. Oral traditions in villages sometimes spoke of individuals who lived outside typical gender roles, carrying spiritual or social importance. Yet, when colonial officials and missionaries later recorded these customs, they often labeled them immoral or erased them altogether. But what do these scattered traces really show? Were they accepted forms of same-sex relationships, or simply stories reshaped by outsiders' words? Did these practices truly reflect everyday life, or are we reading too much into fragments that survived? The evidence is incomplete, leaving space for doubt and for debate. What's your view? Share it in the comments and drop the time you're watching. If history's unanswered questions intrigue you, subscribing is always your choice. You open your eyes to the slow rocking of waves as if the entire ocean is humming a lullaby. It is the 16th century, or maybe the 15th, depending on whose calendar you follow. And Southeast Asia is not one world, but thousands of islands, villages, and kingdoms, strung together like beads on a tangled necklace. Traders drift in and out, Arabs, Chinese Indians, and later Portuguese, all scattering new words and new customs as easily as they scatter coins. And yet, beneath the endless noise of markets and the clang of gongs, there are quieter stories, half hidden. You hear them whispered around hearths, carried in songs, or hinted at in riddles. These are stories of relationships that don't quite fit into the neat husband and wife mold that later colonizers would insist was universal. Were these simply exaggerated campfire tales, or windows into a wider range of love and companionship than official chronicles were willing to admit? Imagine stepping onto one of the Spice Islands, the scent of clove heavy in the air. A local storyteller points out how certain shamans or healers lived in close partnership with their same-sex companions. He doesn't call it strange, he doesn't call it anything at all. It's just life folded into the rhythm of fishing, planting, and praying. Could it be that in these scattered islands, intimacy sometimes carried different shapes, less bound to categories? Or are we only seeing what we want to see, projecting modern labels onto customs that may have meant something else entirely? Sail further south, and the pattern repeats. In certain communities of the Philippines, chroniclers like Antonio de Morga, or later missionaries, mentioned the Babaylan spiritual leaders, often men who dressed and lived as women. Some of these figures had male partners, or at least that's what suspicious Spanish friars wrote down in their journals. But can we really take those friars at their word? Were they shocked outsiders, twisting what they saw into scandal? Or were they unintentionally documenting long-standing traditions of acceptance? When a man puts on garments not assigned to him, and when his closest bonds are with another man, do we immediately leap to one conclusion? Or should we pause and admit the line between ritual role and romance is a tricky one? You pause on a small boat between Borneo and Sulawesi. The sea is dark, the stars relentless. A merchant leans in to tell you that certain aristocrats in Makassar kept young attendants close, showering them with gifts. Was this merely status, the equivalent of flaunting a fine horse, or something more personal? We have no photographs, no love letters, only the faint suggestion that affection might have played a role. And doesn't history often leave us exactly like this, squinting at shadows, trying to decide whether they belong to people or to smoke. Let's not forget the storytellers of Java weaving epics in shadow puppet theaters. In some of the Mahabharata retellings, gender slips disguises occur. Men become women to win wars or survive exile. Audiences laughed, clapped, sighed. Was it just theater or a sly nod to realities lived off stage? Could those myths have provided a safe cover for people who did not follow rigid norms? If you think of modern movies where jokes about taboo subjects slip past censorship, you might see the parallel entertainment carrying truths too delicate to state outright. And then there is the role of trade itself. Imagine hundreds of ships docking at Malacca crews of young men far from home, forming bonds that no parish priest was around to police. When the night grew long and the ale cheap, what arrangements arose? Travelers often wrote about strange customs without explaining further, leaving you with more questions than answers. Do you fill in the gaps with suspicion, or do you leave the puzzle unsolved, letting the silences speak louder than the scattered words? It isn't only written records that leave clues. Some oral traditions across the islands remember men who chose to live with other men or women who pledged themselves to women. These stories survive in fragments passed down with a shrug, as though it were not extraordinary. Could it be that small communities more focused on survival had less time to scold about private bonds? Or perhaps later collectors of folklore already primed by European moral codes glossed over the parts that didn't fit their worldview? How much has been lost in translation, not only between languages, but between centuries? The more you listen, the more you sense a pattern. Southeast Asia was not a monolith, and neither was its understanding of intimacy. Some villages probably turned a blind eye, some celebrated diversity, others surely punished difference. The tricky part is knowing which was which when our surviving evidence comes from outsiders with their own agendas. How do you reconstruct a world where even the words don't line up? The term homosexuality itself is modern, a 19th century invention, dropped like a heavy net over oceans of earlier experiences that never swam under that name. You lean back on the wooden deck, lulled by the waves. Somewhere on the shore, a drum starts up, and voices join in song. You catch only fragments, but they hint at love, both familiar and strange, at bonds that carry weight, whether or not they fit into neat boxes. You're left wondering if these whispers could be confirmed. How differently would we picture pre-colonial Southeast Asia? And if they can't, what does that say about the way history decides which loves deserve to be remembered? You step off the shoreline and into the polished courtyards of a royal palace, where incense clings to your clothes and the sound of gamelan music ripples faintly through the air. Power, after all, does not rest only on armies or taxes. It rests on whispers, on who spends the night in whose chamber, on who sits closest to the throne. In Southeast Asia's pre-colonial courts, kings and sultans surrounded themselves with companions, some for political counsel, some for entertainment, and some for reasons not so clearly recorded. The line between loyalty service and intimacy blurs the moment you start reading the few scattered chronicles that survive. Consider the Javanese courts. Foreign visitors sometimes remarked on young male attendants who were granted special privileges, gifts, and closeness to the ruler. Were these simply pages in waiting, or did their duties extend to companionship that touched the private as well as the public? The records do not say outright, but the detail is suggestive. When you see a king grant land jewels or elaborate garments to one favored companion, you wonder, was this generosity or affection dressed in the language of politics? History leaves you to decide, dangling the clues like bait. Step into Ayutthaya, Siam's capital before Bangkok. Chronicles speak of princes with entourages of pages, and eunuchs their presence explained as service. Yet European envoys, unused to the customs, sometimes describe these bonds with raised eyebrows, scribbling about favoritism and delicate friendships. Were these just the misunderstandings of prudish outsiders, or reluctant confessions of arrangements too obvious to deny? You can almost hear the awkward cough in the margins of their reports. And then there is the Ottoman connection, often overlooked. Southeast Asian courts borrowed freely from West and Central Asia, blending ideas of governance, religion, and yes, palace life. If sultans in Istanbul or Delhi kept close-knit circles of favorites, is it so far-fetched to imagine similar dynamics in Malacca or Aceh? Again, the evidence is scattered, one traveler hinting at beautiful boys in the palace, another alluding to gifts showered upon select companions. Do you dismiss these as Orientalist exaggerations, or accept that where there is smoke, there may be a small flickering fire? The case of eunuchs is especially slippery. In some Southeast Asian courts, castrated servants guarded harems. But in others, they rose to trusted positions closer to rulers than most generals or ministers. Their loyalty was unquestioned, their access unparalleled. What happens when a ruler spends more time in the company of a particular eunuch than his own wives? Is it mere convenience, or a bond that crossed unspoken boundaries? We cannot interrogate the past directly. We only overhear faint echoes of footsteps in palace corridors. Every palace has its stories murmured by servants in shadowy kitchens. You picture a cook pausing over a pot of curry to tell another the king favors that one tonight. Such gossip rarely made it into official annals, which were written to glorify dynasties, not to catalog personal tastes. Still, those offhand remarks preserved in oral tradition, are they idle rumor, or the closest we will ever get to a lost truth? And isn't it curious how some rulers were celebrated for generosity to their favorites, while others were accused of excess? In Burma, chronicles mention kings who promoted particular companions, gifting them ranks or estates. Were these men admired for loyalty or resented for closeness that others envied? Power often attracts jealousy, and sometimes the easiest accusation is that someone has gained influence through unnatural bonds. But is jealousy the same as proof? You might think of modern politics, where headlines explode over who the leader dines with, or who gets the plum appointments. Sometimes it is corruption, sometimes it is friendship, and sometimes the public imagination simply runs wild. The same dynamics may have shaped the gossip of pre-colonial courts. Perhaps what we call hints of homosexuality were in reality the timeless blending of politics, favor, and rumor. Or perhaps those whispers are precisely what they appear: glimpses of love, stories never meant to survive the censor's pen. At the far edge of the palace courtyard, dancers rehearse. Some are men playing women's roles, their movements elegant, their costumes shimmering. The king watches, applauds, and summons one to linger after the performance. What happens next? The sources go silent. You are left with silence, thick enough to hear your own heartbeat. And a single question that history refuses to answer in these gilded halls: how much of power was shaped not only by treaties and swords, but by the tender or turbulent ties between men behind closed doors? You leave the palace walls behind and follow the sound of chanting into a clearing where smoke curls up from a fire. Here the air feels different, less about gold and power, more about drums, trance, and spirits. In many parts of pre-colonial Southeast Asia, ritual specialists guided communities through ceremonies of healing, harvest, and protection. Some of these figures stood out not only for their skills, but for the way they lived neither fully male nor fully female in the eyes of their neighbors. Their names vary: Babalan in the Philippines, Bisu in Sulawesi, Natkadao in Burma. But their presence raises the same puzzle: when spiritual authority allowed someone to step outside everyday gender norms, did that open the door for relationships that we today might describe as same-sex? Or are we bending categories that never quite existed in the same way? Take the Bisu of the Bugis people in South Sulawesi. They were considered a fifth gender, blending masculine and feminine traits, often dressing in a mix of both. Some accounts suggest they had male partners, or at least that men sought their company in ways that went beyond ritual. But how can we be certain Dutch colonial records mention such relationships? Yet the tone drips with judgment and suspicion. Were the colonizers misinterpreting? Or were they stumbling into traditions that locals never found strange until outsiders insisted they were? A similar question hangs over the Babaylan. Spanish missionaries in the Visayas noted that some male shamans dressed as women lived like women and had male companions. One friar even complained that villagers respected these figures too much, refusing to condemn them. Was that acceptance evidence of tolerance, or was it simply a practical decision? Why insult the healer who speaks to the spirits? The line between reverence and approval is fine. And once again, the records come from those who disapproved the loudest. You are left tilting your head, trying to imagine what villagers themselves thought, but never wrote down. And then there are the Nat Kadao in Burma spirit mediums who performed dances during festivals. Some were women married to male spirits. Others were men who took on feminine identities, their husbands living in the audience, applauding. European observers scratched their heads, describing the performances as odd inversions. But were they missing the point? For the community, the medium's role was sacred, not scandalous. Could it be that in their ritualized spaces, alternative forms of intimacy found a rare zone of safety? Or was everything confined strictly to the stage, leaving private life unspoken? Imagine the scene in Sulawesi. The crowd gathers, offerings are piled high, and a Bisu enters trance. Their body trembles, voice shifts. In that moment, their gender ceases to matter. They are a vessel for the divine. Afterward, villagers bring gifts, and perhaps one young man lingers longer than the rest. Was that lingering moment loaded with meaning, or just your modern imagination running ahead? These ritual roles complicate any simple picture of pre-colonial society. They show that not every community policed gender and sexuality along the same rigid lines. At the same time, they don't hand you a neat story of acceptance. Power, respect, and fear all swirl together. A healer might be admired for curing illness, yet mocked behind their back for their mannerisms. A medium might be sought out for blessings, yet avoided outside the festival. Isn't it the same even today, where society tolerates someone in one context but excludes them in another? Think of modern celebrities who bend gender roles on stage, wearing dresses or flamboyant costumes, only to be judged when they step off into real life. Perhaps the same double gaze haunted the shamans of centuries past, revered during the ceremony, questioned in daily life. It's tempting to label them pioneers of a queer history, but maybe they were simply people occupying a role that their societies carved out, neither condemned nor celebrated beyond that role. The fire crackles, the chant fades, and you are left with an uneasy realization. The evidence does not let you pin down a definitive answer. Were shamans and mediums truly living same-sex partnerships? Or were their lives woven from categories that we no longer have the words to describe? The question itself may be a trap, forcing you to choose a label when history whispers only in riddles. The night deepens as you wander away from the fire-lit ceremonies and into narrow village paths where the scent of rice fields lingers and dogs bark lazily at strangers. Here, history feels less polished than in courts or rituals. It's in gossip and the little stories, exchanged over shared palm wine in the quiet agreements that never made it into any chronicle. If love is supposed to be universal, why do so many stories survive of unions that don't fit the neat husband and wife script? Some oral histories from the Visayas and Mindanao collected centuries later recall whispers of men who lived together as special friends, or women who vowed never to marry men and instead shared a household with each other. Were these truly marriages in the way we think of marriage? Or were they partnerships of convenience formed for survival, pooling resources in communities where extra hands meant life or death? Without written contracts or church records, who decides what counted as love and what counted as arrangement? Festivals complicate the picture even further. Certain harvest celebrations in Southeast Asia involved playful reversals, men dressing as women, women taking on men's roles, jokes and performances that blurred the lines for a night. Could these playful masquerades sometimes reveal genuine desires? If two men danced together under lantern light while the crowd laughed, was it just a joke or a safe disguise for something real? The problem is that laughter leaves no record, only memory, and memory changes shape depending on who tells the tale. Missionaries occasionally stumbled across arrangements they described with alarm. One Spanish friar claimed to have witnessed men in a rural Philippine village joined as if married, yet his tone was more scolding than descriptive, leaving you with little detail beyond his disapproval. Was he exaggerating to shock his readers back in Europe, or faithfully reporting a ceremony he didn't understand? And if such unions were truly rare, why mention them at all? Sometimes, the very act of condemning suggests that the practice was visible enough to be noticed. In Indonesia, Dutch ethnographers later noted that among some communities, women could take on male roles, inherit property, and even form households with other women. Was this evidence of tolerance, or simply the acknowledgement that societies sometimes bent rules to keep land or wealth within families? A widow taking a female companion might be protecting her estate rather than making a romantic statement. But is it possible that both explanations overlap, that affection and practicality coexisted, hidden under the same roof? You can almost picture it. Two women sitting together on a bamboo porch at dusk, weaving mats, children from the village running past. Neighbors mutter, but no one interferes. Was that silence a form of quiet acceptance or simply indifference? Sometimes, history's greatest mysteries aren't the dramatic events, but the everyday lives that left no drama at all. And don't modern parallels creep in here too? Think of how roommates in big cities today sometimes get whispered about. Are they just friends or something more? Multiply that by centuries and shift it into the rhythms of a rice farming village, and you can almost hear the same questions echo. Human curiosity doesn't change much, even if the words and categories do. Festivals gossip, widows special friends. Each fragment feels too small to build a definitive claim, yet too consistent to ignore. Maybe villagers didn't carve these bonds into stone because they didn't feel the need to. Or maybe they did, and later centuries sanded down the details, leaving only faint outlines. You can't be sure. All you can do is collect the whispers and ask, were these the faint traces of same-sex unions or the normal practical variations of village life, later magnified by outsiders searching for scandal? You find yourself on a dirt path that climbs toward a fortress on a hill. The sound of drums echoes faintly, and with it comes the image of warriors, bare-chested, tattooed, carrying spears and crises. Loyalty here is carved not only into scars, but into stories of brotherhood, stories that sometimes hint at bonds going beyond comradeship. If you've ever wondered how far friendship can stretch in the heat of battle, this is where the question lingers. Among the Ilongot of Luzon, or the Dayak of Borneo, warriors often pledged themselves to one another with rituals of blood brotherhood. They shared food, weapons, and even households. Was this simply a practical alliance, ensuring that each man had someone to watch his back in the chaos of raids? Or did these sworn partnerships sometimes blur into intimacy that outsiders might interpret differently? When you stand in a longhouse and see two men sleeping side by side, is that just proximity in a crowded world or something more? Bugis and Makassar chronicles occasionally praise warriors who shared a bond as if one soul in two bodies. The phrase might be poetic, but doesn't poetry often veil what prose cannot say directly? Were chroniclers hinting at deep affection or simply elevating loyalty into metaphor? The uncertainty makes you tilt your head. Would we even recognize love if it was expressed in forms so entwined with duty and courage? In Cambodia's Angkor period inscriptions sometimes commemorate male companions who fought together, lived together, and were remembered together. The words carved in stone don't spell out romance, but they do emphasize closeness beyond ordinary kinship. Were these just honored comrades, or something closer to what today we might call partners? How do you tell the difference when the only evidence is chiseled names side by side? You glance at more modern parallels. Think of soldiers in trenches during the World Wars, or explorers stranded on polar expeditions. Bonds forged in danger often carry an intensity that outsiders struggle to understand. Some historians argue that such intimacy can't be labeled with modern categories. Others suggest it might hint at exactly the kind of relationships that official histories later erased. Which view feels truer? Perhaps both sit uneasily together, refusing to let you choose. And then there are the stories passed through song. In some regions, ballads describe pairs of warriors who hunted together, ate together, and were mourned together when one fell. Listeners may have heard them as tales of brotherhood, yet could others have heard something more? When grief is described with the same language as a widow's lament, do your ears perk up, or do you dismiss it as a poetic coincidence? Imagine sitting around a campfire after a raid, listening to men speak of their companions. The tone is reverent, sometimes playful, sometimes mournful. You can't help but ask, if one warrior refused to marry and instead chose to remain in lifelong companionship with another, was that defiance of social norms or an accepted, if unusual, path? Sadly, These are the kinds of details that rarely make it into stone or ink. Even colonial observers caught glimpses of such ties. Some Dutch officers remarked on the extraordinary closeness between Dayak fighters, though they rarely elaborated. Were they too cautious to spell it out? Or did they genuinely not understand what they were seeing? Silence can mean ignorance, but it can also mean discomfort. Which was it here? The fortress looms above torches, flickering along the wall. You can almost see the shadows of men watching each other's backs, laughter and loyalty binding them together. Was it only brotherhood? Or was brotherhood the only word history allowed them to keep? You descend from the fortress into a bustling port town where sails flap against the wind and voices in half a dozen languages tangle together. The air is thick with nutmeg pepper and fish, the smell of money really, and with money comes indulgence. Traders from Arabia, India, China, and later Portugal and Holland all pass through, leaving not just goods, but customs rumors and temptations. If villages left only whispers, port cities leave louder echoes, though still not always clear. You wander through narrow alleys, ducking past warehouses and taverns, and you can't help but wonder, when wealth concentrated in one place did desire follow behind, tucked into side rooms and rented quarters? Malacca in its prime was called a world bazaar. Accounts describe inns packed with sailors travelers sleeping 2 or 3 to a bed. Some observers hinted at strange friendships between young men who seemed inseparable during their stays. Were these simply companions from the same ship, or fleeting romances never meant to be acknowledged? Again, the records are shy, but the hints appear often enough to make you pause. And then there is Makassar, with its markets buzzing from dawn to midnight. Dutch records speak of merchants keeping favorites, often young men gifted clothes or coins. Was this exploitation patronage or genuine companionship? The language is slippery shaded by the colonizers' moral filters. Yet, why note it at all if it were completely invisible? The Dutch were not known for recording every rumor. Something must have caught their eye. Chinese traders added another layer. In southern China, there were precedents for male companionship, structured almost like marriages, particularly in merchant circles. Did these customs spill into Southeast Asian ports, carried by men who stayed abroad for years at a time? If 2 traders from Fujian shared a house in Malacca, is it unthinkable that they also shared affection? The question hovers unanswered like incense smoke in a crowded shrine. Public festivals in port towns often carried theatrical performances. Actors played women's roles regardless of their own sex, drawing applause and admiration. Some became celebrities, admired both on stage and off. Were they sought out after performances by wealthy patrons, as happened in other parts of Asia? If so, what did those private arrangements mean to the people involved? Were they just financial transactions or something resembling companionship in disguise? Picture yourself wandering through a night market, lanterns glowing, hawkers shouting, spices sizzling in pans. You slip into a back alley where a group of young sailors drink cheap palm wine. One of them leans too close to another, and the others laugh knowingly. Is it mockery or recognition of a pattern as old as seafaring itself? Think of modern port cities, Singapore, Marseille, San Francisco, where sailors' quarters often became hotbeds of gossip. Doesn't it make sense that Malacca or Makassar could have had their own versions centuries earlier? Even the economics push you to consider it. In trade hubs, temporary partnerships often made life easier, splitting lodging costs, cooking together, watching each other's backs. But when those partnerships stretched into months or years, did affection grow alongside convenience? The line between friendship and intimacy can blur faster when both survival and profit are on the line. Of course, we must remember that colonial chroniclers often exaggerated what they saw, eager to portray the tropics as morally loose. Were they projecting their own fantasies onto the crowded streets? Possibly. But if they were inventing stories wholesale, why do the same patterns show up in records from different ports written by different observers? Maybe gossip does travel as quickly as spices, but maybe smoke does hint at fire. The taverns grow noisy, dice clatter, and someone sings an off-key ballad. You look around at the sailors, the merchants, the performers, the shadows at the edges of the marketplace. Desire here seems both ordinary and invisible, tucked between trade deals and drunken songs, never written in contracts, but never quite absent either. Was it indulgence, exploitation, or love? The streets won't tell you. They only leave you with the faint sense that behind every market stall lay 100 private stories that slipped away with the tide. The strangest thing about these old reports is how they argue with each other, like squabbling relatives at a feast, each insisting they saw the truth, but none quite matching. A Spanish friar in the Philippines described men who dressed as women and kept male companions, his words dripping with disgust more than clarity. Was he witnessing Babylon priests with honored roles and ritual, or twisting ordinary village dynamics into scandal for European readers? His sentences feel less like description and more like sermon notes. Turn the page and you find a Dutch merchant in Makassar, noting that wealthy men kept youths in their households favored beyond the rest. His tone is flat businesslike, as if recording prices of nutmeg alongside human arrangements. Did he omit the details because he feared church censure back in Batavia? Or did he think it too common to require more explanation? The absence of outrage is almost as telling as the friar's fiery warnings. Then there are Portuguese sources from Malacca muttering about unnatural friendships. The phrase is so vague it could mean anything from handshakes to households. Were they deliberately leaving things unsaid to avoid offending local rulers? Or did they lack the words to describe roles and relationships unfamiliar to them? The translation gap looms wide. What Europeans framed as deviance might have been ordinary companionship, sacred duty, or even respected status within the community. Think about how tourists today can misinterpret customs abroad, snapping quick photos and writing captions that miss the point. Imagine multiplying that confusion by centuries, adding colonial prejudice, and publishing it as fact. No wonder the historical record feels like a tangle of half-truths. Some European accounts even contradict each other outright. A French traveler insisted he saw nothing strange at all, mocking the Dutch for exaggerating. Was he trying to present himself as the reasonable observer, or was he simply blind to what others saw clearly? When sources disagree this sharply, you're left juggling puzzle pieces that will never lock together. And language itself adds another layer of distortion. Words like Bisu or Babylon carried layers of spiritual and social significance. Yet colonial writers squeeze them into terms like sodomite or hermaphrodite categories loaded with judgment and stripped of context. Once translated that way, the original nuance was gone, leaving future historians to inherit a warped reflection. The silence is just as revealing as the noise. These reports shout about unnatural practices, but they never preserve the voices of the people described. What did the Babylon themselves say? How did villagers explain their neighbors' households? Perhaps they never felt a need to defend what was ordinary to them. Ironically, that very lack of local protest now makes the practices look extraordinary to us, simply because the only surviving voices are the loudest critics. The more you sift through these colonial pages, the more you sense the irony. Every outburst of condemnation, every vague aside, is both evidence and distortion at the same time. Something was clearly visible enough to bother writing down, yet its true shape is buried beneath layers of bias and mistranslation. You close the brittle pages and realize you're left not with certainty, but with questions that echo louder than any answer could. You set the papers aside and turn instead to stories carved in stone, sung in ballads, or tucked into manuscripts that were never meant for foreign eyes. Here, desire doesn't appear as blunt confession, but as shadow and allegory. Epic tales in Java, Cambodia, and the Philippines sometimes slip in moments where men disguise themselves as women, or where women pledge themselves to other women, and the audience chuckles knowingly. Were these simply comic interludes, or sly nods to lived realities hiding behind myth? Take the Bugis epic of Ila Galigo, one of the longest literary works in the world. Among its sprawling verses are references to Bisu ritual figures who transcended male and female. Their presence is accepted in the tale without explanation, as though the audience already knew what that meant. Were their relationships hinted at in passing lines too obvious for contemporary listeners to need spelled out? Or are we reading too much into poetic flourishes, seeing coded desire where ancient audiences only heard ritual duty? In Cambodian lore, certain inscriptions and poems speak of devotion between companions whose bond could not be severed by war or death. Were these metaphors of friendship or veiled tributes to partnerships that society acknowledged quietly but never named? When a stele commemorates two men buried together with language usually reserved for married couples, is it simply rhetorical or something more? The stone refuses to explain. It only preserves words that tempt you into questions. Folk tales also tease at boundaries. In some Philippine oral traditions, there are stories of women who avoided marriage to men, instead living in pairs, raising nieces and nephews together. Later collectors sometimes glossed these tales as practical arrangements. But if they were only about survival, why linger on the emotional devotion between the women? Why give them endings filled with loyalty rather than loneliness? Perhaps villagers told the tales with a wink, leaving it to listeners to decide what kind of devotion was being described. Carvings on temple walls occasionally add to the puzzle. In Angkor Wat, where thousands of figures march across stone, you can find pairs of male attendants carved almost identically facing each other with subtle symmetry. Is this artistic convention, or was the sculptor hinting at a bond unspoken scholars debate endlessly, but the carvings never answer? They sit in silence, inviting interpretation, but resisting certainty. You might compare it to modern cinema, where directors slip coded messages past censors, two men sharing a look a little too long, two women whose friendship carries more intensity than the plot admits. Audiences who want to see it. Those who don't dismiss it. Perhaps pre-colonial audiences played the same game, recognizing layers in their epics and songs that outsiders would never notice. Even theater itself complicates the picture. In Java and Bali shadow puppet, plays sometimes featured gender swaps and disguises plots where men lived as women for years, or women dressed as men to claim power. Did audiences laugh simply at the comedy of disguise? Or did they also recognize something more serious beneath humor? often carries truths too delicate to say outright. Could it be that coded desire traveled safely under the cover of a joke? What makes these myths and epics so slippery is that they never tell you directly what to believe. They neither condemn nor celebrate. They simply present leaving gaps for the audience to fill. Are those gaps evidence of acceptance or proof that the subject was too controversial to voice openly? You'll never know for sure. What you do know is that across the region, from Sulawesi's epics to Cambodia's inscriptions, echoes of intimacy between same-sex companions appear again and again, too persistent to dismiss, too vague to prove. The drums of theater fade, the temple carvings grow still, and the folk tales echo faintly in the night air. You are left with allegories that tantalize but never resolve. They make you wonder, were ancient storytellers quietly preserving truths about hidden loves? Or were they simply weaving metaphors that our modern minds have twisted into something else? Morning breaks over the coastline, softer now than the clang of palaces or the clamor of ports. You find yourself in a fishing village where daily life revolves around tides, nets, and fields of rice rather than chronicles or court gossip. Here people survive by leaning on each other, and survival often trumps judgment. If two men shared a hut because it made the workload lighter, did anyone stop to question what went on after dark? Or was the unspoken rule that as long as the nets came back full and the rice harvest was steady, private bonds weren't worth policing? Some colonial observers hinted that in rural areas, friendship households appeared two men or two women pooling land labor and meals. Were these purely economic arrangements? Probably in many cases. But when villagers described such partners as inseparable, mourning them with the same intensity as spouses, doesn't it leave you wondering if affection was folded in alongside necessity? Oral traditions rarely linger on practical chores. They highlight loyalty, care, and grief. What does that say about what mattered to those who remembered? You picture the quiet acceptance of neighbors, a woman who never married a man but raised her sister's children with another woman, a man who chose not to take a wife, but shared his catch and his mat with his lifelong companion. Did people whisper about them, or did they simply shrug and say, that's just how they live? Sometimes the absence of scandal is the strongest clue of all that the arrangement wasn't seen as threatening enough to make noise. Think of how, even today, in small towns around the world, communities often tolerate what they don't fully endorse, provided it doesn't disrupt the rhythm of life. The butcher may gossip, but he still sells you meat. The neighbors may exchange looks, but they still borrow your tools. Perhaps Southeast Asian villages centuries ago worked the same way, letting differences exist in plain sight without rushing to define them. Folk songs occasionally hint at this quiet tolerance. Verses describe companions who shared one pillow until old age, or women who tilled the soil together and grew their laughter in the fields. Do we read these as poetry about kinship, or do they preserve faint memories of unions outside the expected mold? Either way, the language of devotion is strikingly similar to that used in songs about husband and wife. Could that overlap be accidental? Or was it a way of remembering bonds too ordinary to erase, yet too delicate to state directly? Not every story tilts toward acceptance, of course. Some accounts mention teasing, mockery, or suspicion, aimed at those who didn't follow expected paths. Yet, even that suggests visibility. People noticed, people joked, people gossiped. If such households were unthinkable, why bother remarking on them at all? It's the tension between laughter and tolerance that paints the most realistic picture. Neither complete approval nor outright persecution, but a gray zone of uneasy coexistence. Consider, too, the role of necessity. In fishing villages, two men might be gone at sea for weeks, sharing provisions, sleeping close, relying entirely on each other for survival. Would anyone really waste energy condemning intimacy if it kept the crew alive? The logic of survival often outweighs ideology. It's not acceptance in a celebratory sense, but it may be acceptance in practice. As you sit on a bamboo bench, watching children chase each other between huts, you can almost hear echoes of conversations. They're different, but they work hard. That might have been all the judgment that mattered. Perhaps the greatest evidence lies not in grand ceremonies or official records, but in the mundane, in the way everyday people allowed room for lives that didn't mirror their own. The sea breeze carries the smell of salt and smoke. Villagers haul nets laughter spills from the cooking fires, and life continues. Whether or not those quiet partnerships were recognized as love, they were woven into the fabric of daily existence. And sometimes being allowed to exist without constant condemnation is its own kind of survival. The sun sets over the archipelago, and for a moment, the horizon looks like a line between centuries. You stand in the present, but the echoes of the past still hum in your ears. If love leaves no monuments, can its memory still seep through language, ritual, and story? Take the words themselves. In some local languages, there survive old terms for partnerships or roles that don't map neatly onto man and woman. Were these simply descriptions of ritual duties? Or were they quiet acknowledgments of people who lived outside the expected script? Linguists argue, but the persistence of the vocabulary suggests that at the very least the concepts were known. Isn't it curious how words can outlive the certainty of what they once meant? Ritual, too, carries faint reminders. The Bisu in Sulawesi still perform ceremonies today, their presence a living link to pre-colonial roles that defied strict gender categories. Communities may explain them differently now, sometimes filtering them through modern religious expectations. But the survival of the practice is itself a testament. If nothing was ever there, why would fragments linger stubbornly across centuries? Folk tales passed down to grandchildren still murmur about pairs of companions or about shamans who crossed boundaries. Are these simply entertaining stories? Or are they vessels preserving truths too fragile for official chronicles? When elders shrug and say, "That's how it was told to me," do you hear resignation or the careful passing of knowledge that was never meant to be erased? Even modern scholars wrestle with this. Some argue that Southeast Asia was unusually open to fluidity in pre-colonial times, pointing to rituals, songs, and outsider accounts. Others caution that we risk reading back modern categories into worlds that didn't think that way. Both positions circle each other, neither able to deliver a final blow of certainty. And maybe that's the real lesson the past resists being caged in the language of the present. You might think of how family stories work even today. A grandmother recalls a special friendship between two relatives, never elaborating. Was it romance? Was it companionship, born of necessity? The lack of detail frustrates, but it also speaks volumes. The same may be true of Southeast Asia's past. The silence is not emptiness. but a boundary drawn around private lives that were never meant for public judgment. Walk through modern villages, and you still find rituals where men dress as women, or where spiritual leaders embody both masculine and feminine. Outsiders may interpret these performances as quaint tradition, but perhaps they are fragments of something much deeper, echoes of arrangements and identities that once slipped easily into daily life. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the continuity, a faint hum of recognition across centuries. So what survives? Not neat records, not definitive proof, but traces a phrase in a ballad, a line in a chronicle, a carving on stone, a rumor in a missionary's diary. Each fragment, on its own, feels flimsy, but together they form a mosaic. Blurred, yes, but undeniably suggestive. The question is whether you read the mosaic as evidence of hidden loves, or as nothing more than the pattern your own eyes create when staring at scattered dots. The sea breeze rises again, carrying with it the mingled scents of clove and salt. You close your eyes and let the sounds of waves and distant songs overlap. The uncertainty does not frustrate you. Now it feels fitting. After all, love has always been easier to feel than to define, and perhaps that is why it slips through the cracks of history. What you hold in your hands are not certainties, but possibilities, a reminder that in pre-colonial Southeast Asia, as in every age, the human heart moved in ways that no archive could ever fully capture. Across scattered islands and kingdoms, the untold history of homosexuality in pre-colonial Southeast Asia lingers in whispers. Ritual leaders who defied categories, village households quietly shared by same-sex companions, court favorites showered with gifts and myths that blurred friendship and devotion. The records are never certain, colored by colonial bias and silence, yet they leave enough fragments to suggest that intimacy and identity were more fluid than later societies allowed. If love hid in shadows, gender itself often stood in twilight too. And that leads you naturally into the next question. What roles did women and gender truly play in pre-colonial Southeast Asia? In the heart of pre-colonial Southeast Asia, it's not a king or a warlord shouting orders. It's a woman standing in the middle of a rice field, sarong, tucked high voice carrying over the paddies like a general commanding troops. The irony. She's not wielding a sword, just a wooden stick for checking water levels. Yet everyone moves when she speaks. You look around and see men sweating under the sun, but she's the one telling them when to transplant seedlings, when to flood the fields, when to harvest. It makes you wonder who really held the reins of daily survival here. The more you walk along the dikes, the clearer it becomes. Rice wasn't just food. It was life itself, and women guarded that life with a grip so firm that kingdoms would have starved without them. In societies stretching from the Mekong Delta to the islands of the Philippines, the success of the family and the community hinged on the knowledge women carried. They knew which soils cracked too quickly, which pests needed crushing between fingernails, and which rituals appeased the spirits believed to protect the harvest. And while men might have fought wars or gone off trading for months, the women stayed ensuring that when they returned, there would still be rice in the granary. Isn't it funny how the most ordinary labor becomes the most extraordinary form of power when everyone's belly depends on it? When you peek inside homes, the story doesn't shift much. You'd expect the household to be strictly patriarchal, but instead, you find women managing daily rhythms with the precision of an accountant, mixed with the softness of a mother. In many places, particularly among Tagalog and Visayan groups, Women were the keepers of household wealth, cloth jewelry jars of rice wine, and even gold pieces tucked into bamboo tubes. These weren't trinkets, they were assets, and women controlled their distribution. Men could negotiate outside, but at home they had to defer to the quiet authority of their wives and mothers. It wasn't always loud or dramatic, but influence rarely is. Think of it like running a small company where the CEO happens to also cook the meals and organize the kids. Except here, the company's stock was not measured in shares, but in jars of rice rolls of cloth and the number of pigs tied behind the house. A woman could decide which pig to slaughter for a feast, which bundle of textiles to keep for her daughter's wedding, or which neighbor to lend rice to in exchange for favors later. This kind of authority wasn't formalized in documents or contracts. It was lived, enacted, and reinforced every single day. Could it be that their economic management made them the quiet backbone of village politics too? And then there's the unspoken part of this balance. While men often left for hunting, trading voyages, or occasional skirmishes, the household didn't crumble in their absence. Women's competence made them indispensable, and everyone knew it. In fact, anthropologists studying remnants of these traditions have pointed out how astonishingly egalitarian some communities were in contrast to later colonial influences. Sure, men had prestige in warfare and leadership, but what is prestige without rice to feed the warriors? You can almost hear a mother's sarcastic tone across the centuries. Go win your little battle, but don't forget who keeps your stomach full. If you pause for a moment and compare, you might find echoes even in modern life. In some rural Southeast Asian villages today, it's still the mother who hands out the cash for school fees, or quietly reminds the father when debt collectors are coming. It's the same logic, just dressed in modern clothes. And if you think of big corporate families in urban settings, how many still rely on women to balance books, coordinate children's schedules, and keep households afloat while the men chase headlines? The continuity is almost unsettling. Names sometimes pop out of the records, giving faces to this pattern. In the Malay world, the position of Ibu Rumah Tangga, mother of the household, was not a ceremonial title. It was the real center of gravity. In Javanese traditions, the term istri didn't just mean wife, but also the core, the one who keeps the fire. And in Philippine accounts, Spanish friars often noted how shocked they were to see wives arguing openly with their husbands about property or trade deals. They thought it was scandalous. Locals just thought it was normal. So as you trudge back across the muddy banks with your sandals sticking to the earth and the smell of young rice sharp in the air, you realize that gender roles here didn't neatly follow the man leads, woman follows script imported later. Instead, there was a tug-of-war of respect and dependence, an equilibrium maintained not by ideology, but by survival itself. Men and women were woven into the fabric of daily labor, yet women's threads were thicker knotted around food property and family continuity. And really, can anyone claim power more convincingly than the one who decides when everyone eats? You drift from the patties into the market square, and suddenly the air thickens with spice sweat and the sound of 100 bargains being shouted at once. And here's the twist. Most of the people calling out prices aren't men at all, but women. They lean over baskets of rice, bolt upright behind piles of fish, and squat with practiced ease beside jars of palm wine. It's a carnival of commerce, and the queens of this noisy court are mothers, daughters, widows, and grandmothers who know exactly how to work your hesitation into an extra coin or two. Everywhere you look, women dominate the rhythm of trade. In coastal ports like Malacca or Manila, foreign merchants arriving with porcelain silk or iron tools often found themselves negotiating not with the local rulers first, but with market women. These women determined what goods were valuable, what could be sold quickly, and what should be hoarded until prices rose. You imagine some poor Chinese trader sweating under the tropical sun, trying to explain his cargo, only to be dismissed by a woman who knows her market better than he ever will. Isn't it delicious to think how many great voyages were quietly shaped by the calculations of village aunties sitting on woven mats? And this wasn't small change either. In many societies, women controlled entire market networks. In Vietnam, records from the Red River Delta describe women traders as the backbone of local commerce, their voices echoing across riverside stalls. In the Philippines, Spanish chroniclers marveled sometimes with irritation at the way Filipina vendors refused to lower prices even for high-ranking foreigners. If you've ever haggled at a flea market today, you might feel a sense of déjà vu. That same sharp wit, that unyielding take it or leave it attitude, has centuries of practice behind it. Of course, the market wasn't just about selling fish or cloth. It was about authority and independence. A widow, for example, could support herself entirely through trade maintaining dignity without depending on male relatives. Young women learned bargaining skills early, not from textbooks, but from tagging along to the market, watching how their mothers tilted scales just slightly, or layered charm with sarcasm to get better deals. Doesn't that remind you of modern-day business schools, except with more beetle nut stains and fewer PowerPoint slides? Now you might wonder, did men just stand aside? Not exactly. Men brought goods in timber salt or livestock, but the final say on price often landed in women's hands. Think of it as a relay race. Men harvested or crafted, then passed the baton to women who sprinted the last leg in the marketplace, ensuring profit and household survival. It was a symbiotic partnership, but the edge of decision-making was sharpest in the hands of women. Some rulers understood this dynamic and leaned on it. The Achenese queen, Sultana Safiatuddin Shah, in the 17th century, presided over an empire of spice, but the heartbeat of her economy pulsed in local markets, run by women. Without their networks, pepper and cloves wouldn't have flowed as steadily into Dutch and Portuguese ships. History books might highlight treaties and wars, but behind the scenes it was market women who made sure trade routes didn't dry up. Picture this. You're in Malacca's central square in the early 1500s, surrounded by Gujaratis, Arabs, Chinese, and Malays, and everyone is jostling for a deal. Who decides whether the pepper goes for 2 coins or 3? It's not the Portuguese captain. It's the woman in a bright batik sarong, squinting at the scales and shaking her head. You can almost hear her mutter, "Nice try, foreigner." Even today, if you walk through Southeast Asian wet markets, you'll find echoes of this tradition. Stalls are overwhelmingly run by women, their hands moving faster than calculators as they weigh bag and negotiate without breaking rhythm. It's not just economic activity. It's an inheritance of power, a daily reenactment of centuries-old dominance in the sphere of trade. If you've ever been caught paying double for a mango while locals pay half, you felt the sharp end of that legacy. So as you leave the marketplace with your ears ringing from all the laughter arguments and clanging coins, you realize women here weren't confined to kitchens or silent corners. They were the lifeblood of trade, the guardians of economic balance, and the unsung negotiators of regional wealth. Who needs a crown when you can set the price of pepper? You leave behind the shouts of the market and stumble into the quieter but equally dramatic world of marriage negotiations. Forget the romantic candlelit dinners you might picture. Here, alliances are hammered out under bamboo roofs, with voices raised elders debating, and women's opinions woven into the process like threads in a mat. The fascinating part, unlike in many other parts of the world, a bride in pre-colonial Southeast Asia wasn't simply handed over like property. She was an active participant, her consent and her worth measured in negotiations that carried real economic weight. You see two families gathered together, mat spread jars of rice wine set out to ease the tension. The bride's mother sits with her arms folded, listening carefully, while the groom's father fidgets with nervous energy. On the table between them lies the question of bride wealth gifts of cloth gold livestock or jars of rice that the groom's family offers. It isn't a purchase. It's a recognition of the woman's value and the loss her family will feel when she leaves. Her hands have tended the rice, her skills have kept the household afloat, replacing that is no small matter. Have you ever thought about how that flips the script compared to later colonial ideas of women as dependents? In Tagalog society, these negotiations could involve gold ornaments, finely woven cloth, or even slaves in rare cases, while in the Malay world it might be trays of betel leaves, jars of oil, or buffalo. What's striking is that women weren't excluded from these talks. A young woman could veto a match she didn't want, and her opinion mattered in ways that would shock Europeans who later wrote about submissive Asian women. Even Spanish friars in the 16th century noted with irritation that Filipina brides could refuse a suitor no matter how much wealth was on the line. As you lean closer, you notice another detail. The gifts aren't one way. The bride's family often provided dowries, 2 land tools, or heirloom jewelry that would strengthen the new household. In some parts of the archipelago, property was pooled, and both partners had rights to manage it. Imagine the contrast to societies where women were legally invisible. Here she entered marriage with resources, not empty-handed. Doesn't that make the whole institution feel less like transfer and more like partnership? Marriage also tied families together beyond economics. It created alliances across villages, secured peace, and ensured cooperation. A daughter's hand in marriage might prevent a feud, or a well-arranged union could guarantee access to fertile fields. And because women carried so much household knowledge, families sought brides not just for beauty or charm, but for their skills and reputation. Wouldn't you want your son to marry the daughter of the best rice cultivator in the valley? You picture the wedding itself, bright sarongs, garlands of flowers, music echoing from gongs, and food flowing like water. The bride steps forward, not veiled in silence, but adorned in gold, and beads her presence celebrated as the foundation of the new household. Sometimes, she even chose to live with her own family after marriage, what anthropologists call matrilocal residence, giving her kin greater security and keeping property close to home. Try telling that to a medieval European bride who had to leave everything behind. Some real names pierce through the general patterns. In ancient Java, noblewomen entered marriages that bolstered dynasties, but their contracts protected their lands and rights. In the Philippines, accounts describe women who divorced and remarried without scandal if marriages soured. Divorce wasn't a shameful secret. It was a recognized option, another sign that women's agency mattered. Imagine a friar furiously scribbling about this practice in his journal, aghast at the looseness while locals simply shrugged and poured another round of palm wine. What stands out to you most, though, is the balance struck in these customs. Marriage wasn't just about romance or obligation. It was about negotiation, partnership, and recognition of women's value. A woman might gain land status and independence through the process, and she had a voice in whether the match even happened. Can you think of how different history might have looked if such principles had been the global norm? In many pre-colonial Southeast Asian societies, daughters didn't just get a token trinket, while sons took the land they inherited property outright, sometimes even more than their brothers. You might have thought the script would follow the patriarchal model familiar elsewhere, but no. The balance here tilted in fascinating directions. Property, from rice paddies to coconut groves, often flowed along maternal lines, and that simple fact quietly redefined power. Picture a daughter in a Javanese household, carefully counting her mother's gold bracelets and the carved wooden chests that hold fine batik cloth. Those items aren't symbolic. They are wealth, and they can be passed directly into her hands. In Minangkabau culture, still matrilineal today, ancestral land belongs to women, passed from mother to daughter, ensuring that no matter what storms of politics or war swept through the family line, had a secure anchor. Isn't it astonishing that in a region later labeled backward by outsiders, women were trusted with something as foundational as the land itself? The system wasn't uniform across the region, of course. In parts of the Philippines, inheritance could be bilateral, with property divided between sons and daughters. Yet in many cases, women's claims were protected fiercely. You might imagine disputes arising brothers, challenging sisters, but records show that families often lean toward preserving a woman's rights, knowing that households depended on her continuity. The logic was simple. If women managed rice and markets, why shouldn't they control the land that fed those systems? And there's another layer here. Because women inherited, they had leverage in marriage. A bride entering her new household didn't walk in empty-handed. She brought land jewelry or livestock that gave her security. Think of it like modern prenups, except instead of lawyers drafting pages, it was custom and community that safeguarded her assets. Can you feel how much independence that created? Sometimes the scale was much larger. In Champa and parts of Cambodia, inscriptions record royal women donating land to temples, their names etched in stone as givers of wealth and patrons of religion. Imagine wandering through ancient ruins and seeing not only the kings, but also queens and princesses credited with endowing rice fields for the gods. It's a reminder that property wasn't just survival, it was prestige, and women's inheritance gave them the means to shape culture itself. Of course, not every society was fully matrilineal, and men certainly had strong claims, especially in noble families where succession mattered for dynasties. But even then, the picture was more nuanced than you'd expect. In Java, for example, royal women could inherit lands and pass them to children, ensuring dynastic stability, even if husbands shifted or disappeared. In Vietnam, Chinese influence brought Confucian ideals, but older traditions clung stubbornly, with daughters still receiving shares. Doesn't that persistence show how deeply rooted these customs were? Think for a moment about the modern parallel. Today, arguments over inheritance can split families apart, with wills contested in court. Back then, the rules were clear enough to provide stability, but flexible enough to adapt. And crucially, they embedded respect for women's role at the heart of society. If you own the rice fields, the coconut groves, and the jewelry that funds trade, You don't need to shout for influence, you already have it. There's a delightful irony in how outsiders saw this. Early European visitors, steeped in male-centered inheritance laws, often wrote with thinly veiled confusion about why women were so prominent in these transfers. Some even assumed it was chaos, a lack of proper order. Yet when you look closer, the order is obvious, a balanced system where property secured both women's independence and the continuity of families. It wasn't chaos. It was a quiet, practical brilliance. So as you sit with the image of a daughter walking confidently across her family's land, heirloom beads glittering at her neck, you realize that inheritance here was more than paperwork. It was the engine of stability, the assurance of autonomy, and the subtle hand that shaped generations. And really, who holds the future if not the one who holds the land? You wander away from the clinking of heirloom jewelry and land deeds, and suddenly you find yourself at the edge of a village, clearing where smoke curls lazily from a fire. Here, the atmosphere is quieter, almost heavy, because this is where people come not to haggle over coconuts, but to consult the unseen. A woman steps forward, her hair bound loosely, her eyes steady, and you realize she isn't just another villager. She's a shaman, a medium, a healer. And in this world, women aren't just tolerated in such roles. They are revered. She holds a bowl of water, watching ripples form as she murmurs words no outsider understands. Around her, people wait with both patience and fear. When a child is sick, when the rice spirits seem angry, when disputes threaten to tear the village apart, it is often women like her who mediate between the human and the divine. And doesn't that tell you something about authority? To channel the voice of spirits, to decide when to plant or to heal wounds with herbs. This wasn't superstition in the eyes of villagers. It was necessity, and it placed women at the spiritual heart of community life. Traveling through the archipelago, you'd encounter dozens of variations. In the Philippines, the Babaylan stood tall, women shamans, who led rituals healed with chants, and even resisted Spanish colonization. One Spanish friar wrote half frustrated and half impressed that the Babaylan had more influence over villagers than he did, because when she spoke, people listened. In Vietnam, female mediums became vessels for spirits in ceremonies that later evolved into Lenjong rituals. And in parts of Indonesia, women presided over fertility rites, their songs believed to coax life out of barren fields. How striking is it that women were trusted to bridge both earth and heaven? The tools of their trade might look simple to your eyes: gourds of rice, wine bundles of herbs, drums beaten at odd rhythms. But behind each object was knowledge accumulated through generations. A Babaylan knew which leaves soothed fevers, which chants calmed restless spirits, and which taboos should never be broken. Her authority wasn't written in books, but lived in practice. It's almost like modern doctors and therapists combined, except with rituals and smoke instead of stethoscopes and notepads. These roles also blurred gender lines in fascinating ways. In some communities, men could only take on shamanic duties if they adopted female dress or mannerisms, a recognition that the power of mediation was considered inherently feminine. Imagine the ripple that caused in societies where gender was less rigidly policed than in later centuries. Doesn't it make you pause and wonder how many modern ideas about gender fluidity are actually echoes of much older practices? And shamans weren't just healers. They were political players too. A respected Babaylan could influence whether a village went to war, whether alliances were honored or whether a leader retained legitimacy. Colonial officials quickly noticed this. Spanish accounts describe attempts to discredit or even persecute female shamans precisely because they threatened the authority of priests and governors. Yet even under pressure, many women clung to their roles, leading underground rituals and passing their knowledge quietly to the next generation. Think about how much trust this required. In a world without laboratories or microscopes, people placed their lives in the hands of women who read omens in fire or water. And time and again, these women proved themselves by curing illnesses, settling disputes, and ensuring crops flourished. Doesn't that sound familiar to the way communities today still turn to grandmothers, herbalists, or spiritual leaders for guidance, even when hospitals and courts exist? Some roles are too deeply woven into culture to disappear. You might even recall names of legendary figures. In Philippine lore, figures like Dewata or Babalan priestesses are remembered not just as healers, but as leaders who stood up to invaders. In Borneo, tales tell of women who became spirit queens, their advice sought in times of drought or war. These aren't side characters. They're protagonists in the story of survival. So as you watch the shaman pour water into the earth, whispering prayers that curl upward like smoke, you realize her presence isn't ornamental. It's foundational. She isn't on the margins of society, she is. Its heartbeat. A reminder that in pre-colonial Southeast Asia, women's authority stretched far beyond rice fields and markets. They carried the voices of ancestors and gods, and in doing so, they carried the weight of whole communities on their shoulders. You wander further, past the village fire and the murmurs of shamans, and suddenly, history takes on a sharper edge. The question presses itself into your ears like the clang of a gong. What happens when women step not just into homes, fields, markets, but into thrones and battlefields? You expect silence, after all. Weren't kingdoms everywhere run by men? Yet Southeast Asia throws curveballs, and some of the loudest names echoing through its pre-colonial halls of power are women's. You stand before the figure of Queen Tribhuwana Wijayatunga Dewi of Majapahit in 14th century Java. Her title is long enough to trip over, but her reign was firm. She didn't simply sit as a placeholder. She expanded the empire's reach across much of the archipelago. The chronicles remember her presiding over councils and directing campaigns. Imagine that a woman commanding fleets while merchants and warriors alike bowed to her authority. Isn't it striking that in an era when many European queens still fought for recognition here, she was running one of the largest empires in Southeast Asian history? Move west, and you find the queens of Aceh in the 17th century sultanas like Safiatuddin Shah, ruling after the deaths of their husbands. For nearly 6 decades, Aceh was governed by women, their signatures sealing treaties with the Dutch, their decrees shaping trade in pepper and spices. European visitors often wrote in disbelief, assuming this female rule was a temporary accident. But locals accepted it. Authority flowed where it was needed. And if that meant through a queen, then so be it. Doesn't it make you grin to picture stiff European envoys trained to bow, only before kings, suddenly finding themselves bowing before a woman in a jeweled headdress? And it wasn't just palaces. In Vietnam, Lady Trio, in the 3rd century CE, rose against Chinese domination. The chronicles remember her as a warrior astride an elephant defying armies far larger than her own. Her legend survived because she symbolized courage, not caution. In the Philippines, women sometimes took up arms in defense of their communities, fighting alongside men with little hesitation. You can almost hear the echo of their defiance in every folk tale that insists bravery is not a gendered trait. Of course, political power could also come through regency. When kings were young or absent, queens or mothers often acted as guardians of the throne. In Java and Cambodia, inscriptions reveal women named as protectors of dynasties, guardians of legitimacy. Authority wasn't just ceremonial, it was practical. They controlled land-directed rituals and made decisions that could shape the survival of a kingdom. Step into a court, and you'd also find women wielding influence less visibly, but just as powerfully. Royal mothers, sisters, and consorts often advised rulers, mediated disputes, or secured alliances through diplomacy. And unlike in some regions where royal women were cloistered away here, many were active participants in governance. Doesn't it shift your assumptions when you realize that palace politics in Southeast Asia was often a family affair, with women steering as much as men? If you compare it with the modern world, you might think of corporate dynasties, where widows or daughters take over companies, running them with sharp instincts that outsiders underestimated. History is littered with examples of people who underestimated women in power, only to be proven wrong. Southeast Asia was no exception, except here, the underestimation often came from foreign eyes, not local ones. It's not all triumph, of course. Records also show tension. Some male elites resented the prominence of queens, and later Islamic and European influences questioned the legitimacy of women's authority. Yet the fact that these debates existed shows just how visible female leadership was in the first place. You don't argue against something invisible. You argue because it's present and strong. So, as you walk away from these palaces and battlefields, the image lingers: women seated on carved wooden thrones, armored on elephants, or signing trade agreements with foreign merchants. Their fingerprints are on the land, the law, and the legacy of pre-colonial Southeast Asia. And the lesson whispers clearly: power here wasn't a monopoly. It was a stage where women could, and often did, take center spotlights. You step from the dim shade of a stilt house, and the village lane turns into a runway. Sarongs, swish brass, gleams tattoos read like passports, and gender moves with a grace that ignores the boxes you brought from home. You were expecting uniforms of men do this, women wear that. But Southeast Asia shakes its head, adjusts a hairpin, and keeps walking. Your eyes settle first on cloth. Everywhere you look, fabric talks. In lowland, river deltas, you catch the ripple of tube skirts, sampot in Khmer lands, seen in Lao and Thai country, and sarong wrapped across so much of the archipelago. The weaves have personalities. Java's batik breathing, waxy geometry, Bali's endek, shimmering with subtle checks, the islands of the east singing in a cat. Each thread dyed before the loom ties them into thunderheads and waves. You lean near and smell starch and wood smoke. You hear the tiny click of shell bangles as a vendor flips a length of cloth, the way a DJ flips a record. Who needs labels when a motif already says Clan River and rank batik tells you politics without speeches? In Central Java, barang and kawang patterns speak of palaces, with some motifs once reserved for Creighton Court's fabric as etiquette cloth as law. On the Khmer plain, a plaid of krama scarves winks from necks and waists, equally happy on farmers, fisherwomen, and monks. It's one item, a dozen uses, like the Swiss Army knife of textiles. In the Visayan Islands, you glimpse older habits peeking through Spanish complaints. Dyed cottons, striped wraps, and for high-status imported silks. Chroniclers grumbled that people were too fond of color, which, if we're honest, sounds like jealousy. Then the jewelry announces itself. You hear the little rain of bronze bells at ankles, see cascades of silver coins stitched to headcloths, catch the sun shouting off a crescent of gilt at someone's throat. Dayak ear pendants lengthen lobes into living sculpture, while Taraja bead collars lie like constellations across chests. In markets ruled by women, remember those bargaining queens. Gold bangles are savings accounts and social media. In one wealth taste family news, all flashed in a flick of the wrist. If your modern brain wants an analogy, think of streetwear drops, limited pattern, instant status resale value, humming in the background. You notice tattoos too, not as rebellion, but as biography. Among the pintados that early Spaniards met in the Visayas, skin carried zigzags, beasts, and wave ropes, marking battles fought or voyages survived. The ink was a curriculum vitae you couldn't fake. Across Borneo, motifs crept from shoulder to hand like vines, each thorn and leaf a prayer for protection. Even teeth joined the style conversation, blackened with beetle, or soot in some places filed, or gilded in others, a beauty code that baffled later missionaries. You tilt your head, strange to you. Yes, but is it any stranger than bleaching braces or veneers? Fashion is just culture's favorite inside joke. Clothing lines don't map cleanly onto gender. You see men in sarongs and women in sarongs, men bare-chested under the heat, and women in breastcloths, or sabai drapes, all calibrated to climate, labor, and occasion, rather than a universal rule book. Hair is a social signal. Top knots coiled with wood pins, side buns wedged with silver combs, loose lengths braided for work, and unrolled for festivals. Scent trails behind people, pandanus leaf coconut oil, a brush of benzoin resin turning the lane into a slow parade. And then gender expression does that Southeast Asian thing again, shrugs off your categories. You remember back by the ritual fire, that shaman's steady gaze still in your head, how some male mediums wore women's cloth and hair not as costume, but as license to mediate the human and divine. In Bugis country of South Sulawesi, elders speak of 5 gendered roles: Oroane men, Makunrai; women, Kalalai, female-bodied with masculine roles; Kalabai, male-bodied with feminine roles; and Bisu, androgynous ritual specialists. You watch a Bisu adjust a sash with the same matter-of-fact grace a rice field matriarch used when she ordered transplanting. Authority sits in the role, not the body. Does that surprise you, or does it feel oddly practical? When a community needs a bridge, it chooses whoever can carry the weight. Elsewhere, you spot echoes with local names. In Old Tagalog and Visayan accounts, the Asog were male-bodied ritual experts who adopted feminine attire. Spanish pens scratched nervously about this, while villagers simply followed the person who got results. In the mainland courts, ceremonial attire sometimes softened the hard edges of gender-wrapping princes and princesses in similar silks for rites where rank trumped binaries. Your modern instincts search for grand theories. The village keeps handing you working realities. Everyday labor folds into the wardrobe. A fisherwoman knots her sampot higher to wade the shallows. A porter flips his sarong into shorts to shoulder rattan baskets. A vendor parks a krama scarf as a sun hood at noon and a baby sling by dusk. Clothes aren't prisons. They're tools, modular, convertible, optimized. If a tech company designed garments with this many use cases, you'd see a keynote and a queue around the block. Here, you see muscle memory and 1,000 small adjustments learned by watching aunties and uncles since you could toddle. You catch flashes of real people your textbooks only half mentioned. Court ladies in Ayutthaya, balancing lacquer trays with a glide dancer's still copy. Javanese girls learning batik canting dots of wax turning into storms and rice terraces. Highland weavers counting with their thumbs, not their eyes, while gossip skims along the heddles. And yes, the occasional aristocrat in palms and parang batik, who could discuss poetry in the foyer and household ledgers in the kitchen, toggling registers the way she rearranges pins in her hair. Want to play Spot, the influencer. She's right there 400 years early. Custom brushes against modesty codes without apology. In the heat, bare shoulders are comfort, not scandal. Breastcloths and sashes are normal, not transgressive. Later foreign creeds will bring stricter rules tailoring lines and lowering hemlines. But right now, practicality wins. Cover what the sun burns free, what the work demands. You realize how many of your own assumptions about proper dress were born in climates far from the equator. When sweat is your hourly companion, ethics of fabric turn deeply ecological. You pause for one of those small interactive moments if you opened your closet tomorrow and had to keep only what worked for heat rain, sitting on mats, climbing boats, and attending a cousin's wedding. How much would survive the cut? Which pieces would still make you feel like you signaling family taste and the work you're good at? That's the game being played here, and it's older than hashtags. From the corner of your eye, you notice a grandmother tapping lime into a beetle quid, lips stained a dignified rust. Her bangles are thin, not rich, but the pattern on her sarong is precise, the kind of village weave that says I come from people who know how to do things. A teenager passes half daring, half awkward in a bolder motif. You recognize the species, instantly youth trying on a louder version of themselves. Across the lane, a bassoon ties a sash, and a fisherman tucks his krama into a head wrap that keeps the glare off the river. The choreography is unforced, the vocabulary shared. By the time the afternoon light tilts, you've learned to read the street better. Cloth as biography medal, as savings ink, as achievement, scent, as presence hair, as punctuation, and gender, as role chosen, learned performed, respected. You don't need a thesis to follow it. You just need to keep watching the lane like a tide and let the patterns teach you what they already know. You keep following that parade of sarongs and tattoos until the scene warps. The fabrics are still there, but now another set of eyes is scribbling notes, colonial outsiders clutching journals, frowning at what they don't understand. You overhear mutters in Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, and later French, each voice tinged with confusion. To them, women bustling in markets inheriting rice fields, or standing as shamans seemed less like order and more like chaos. And so they wrote and miswrote, turning societies they barely grasped into footnotes for European audiences back home. Imagine a friar in 16th century Manila watching a Bebaylan lead a ritual. Smoke curls, chants rise, and villagers follow her every move. The friar scribbles witchcraft deception scandal. To him, a woman channeling spirits had to be a servant of the devil, not a respected guide. Yet in reality, she was the community's doctor-counselor and priestess rolled into one. Doesn't it make you laugh how much authority can look like disorder when you're holding the wrong lens? Or picture a Dutch merchant in Malacca's markets. He expects to haggle with male officials only to find women running most stalls. He notes in his log, they are loud, unruly, difficult to manage. But behind the noise lies a well-oiled system of prices, trust, and supply chains. His failure wasn't the women's conduct. It was his inability to see structure where he didn't expect it. Have you ever walked into a modern open-air market and felt overwhelmed only to realize later that every vendor knows exactly where they fit? The feeling is timeless. Colonial records often reframe what was normal. Women inheriting property improper. Female rulers in Aceh temporary anomalies. Gender-fluid shamans in Bugis, lands perverse. These labels weren't neutral, they were tools. By dismissing existing systems as chaotic colonial powers, justified replacing them with their own. And so slowly, they imposed patrilineal inheritance laws, Christian and Islamic codes of modesty and bureaucracies that squeezed women out of visible roles. Isn't it chilling how words on paper can reshape entire societies? But if you read between the lines, the cracks in their bias glow. Some Spanish accounts admit grudgingly that Filipino women could refuse marriage offers and divorce without disgrace. Portuguese reports from Maluku note with irritation that queens could sign treaties and negotiate pepper prices. Even when colonial pens tried to diminish them, women's prominence bled through the ink. You can almost picture the frustration. Why won't these women just step aside? There's a modern echo here too. Think about travel blogs that describe Southeast Asian traffic as madness. To an outsider, the honking and weaving of motorbikes feels like chaos. But to locals, it's choreography. Everyone knows the rhythm, everyone flows. Colonial observers did the same with gender and authority, mistaking unfamiliar order for disorder. Doesn't that make you wonder how much of what we call civilization is just familiarity wearing a smug face? Some individuals stand out against this backdrop. The Spanish Jesuit Francisco Alsina, for instance, left records of Visayan society in the 17th century. While biased, his accounts still reveal women's importance in trade, inheritance, and ritual. Or take Dutch accounts of the queens of Aceh. Though they doubted the longevity of female rule, they couldn't deny that treaties bore women's seals. These records, though, warped accidentally preserved proof that women weren't side notes, but central figures. You can almost hear the whispered exchanges, villagers rolling their eyes at yet another foreigner who misread their customs, merchants chuckling as outsiders fumbled negotiations, shamans smirking at priests who thought chants were tricks. The gulf between perception and reality was wide, but the documents piled up, carrying those misreadings across oceans. And when colonial administrations solidified those early biases, hardened into law. So as you set down the brittle pages of those old reports, your hands dusty with the words of men who couldn't see past their own expectations, you realize how much of history depends on who holds the pen. And in pre-colonial Southeast Asia, women's prominence was so glaring that even the most dismissive pens couldn't fully erase it. You close the colonial ledger dust still on your fingers, and the village night opens like a stage crickets tuning a pot lid, clinking children shuffling closer as the story fire cracks with a showman's timing. The old teller clears a throat that has bargained in markets, planted rice on bad moons, and argued with a shaman about which herb actually works. Then the voice drops to that conspiratorial hush you've been waiting for, long before the foreigners wrote their confused notes our grandmothers taught with dragons. And just like that, the room belongs to the women again. A serpent tail ripples through the first tale, and you recognize the shaped naga scales, glinting like hammered bronze in the flame. In Khmer lands, they say a stranger named Kaundinya shot an arrow across the water and married Soma, a Naga princess. She did not trade her tail for legs, she brought the river with her. The marriage wasn't a prize snatched by a hero. It was a pact with the land, a joining of wet season power and human need. You can smell rain as the teller speaks, and you remember the rice field matriarch calling the flood like a forewoman of the monsoon. Authority here is amphibious, and a princess who commands the water is not a fantasy. She's agricultural policy told as a love story. The tone shifts, and suddenly elephants are stomping in your skull. Vietnam's stories pull in historical beats. You've already met Lady Trung Track and Lady Trung Ni riding war elephants, and Lady Trio daring a garrison with a voice that still rattles teacups. The folk tales tuck them beside the mother of the country, U Ko, who births 100 eggs that become 100 children. There's a motherhood so large it contains a map. You hear the lullaby logic. The nation isn't forged in iron alone. It is also knitted by a woman's breath, counting babies into clans. If you're looking for a moral, the fire obliges women don't just defend the land. Sometimes they are the land. Java steps in wearing shadow. A Dalang flicks leather puppets against a lamp, and Shrikandi Archer tactician trouble for anyone who assumes a quiet wife tilts her bow. In Wyong retellings, she claims space among the Pandawa heroes, without apologizing, as comfortable in the training yard as she is at court. The audience shifts their weight as if to follow her stance, and you notice how the room accepts her competence like gravity. Remember the women who set pepper prices while foreign captains pouted? Shrikandi is that same shrug, rendered in cut leather. It isn't rebellion to be good at what needs doing. Then a wind of perfume and riddle blows in from the Malay courts. Buteri Gunung Ledang, the princess of Mount Ophir, listens patiently, while Malacca's sultan sends impossible bride price demands. Gold-silver beetle trays, a bowl of royal blood. The punchline delivered with auntie-level timing is that the princess never wanted to marry him. She wanted to instruct him. A ruler who treats marriage like a conquest misses the curriculum. Your mind flashes to the market lane. How many men tried to haggle down a price they hadn't earned? The legend smiles and adds interest. Across the sea, the Philippines rings a brass gong and spills out epics that take nights to finish. In Panay's Hinilawod, the goddess Aluncina, Launcina, the unmarried one, chooses her own partner, despite a council of gods that would have written a stricter script. Later, Nagmalitong Yawa, a warrior woman whose name carries a misread shadow when filtered through colonial ears, pulls off rescues and stratagems with the flair of someone who has watched 100 market deals go sideways and decided to write a better ending. Spanish chroniclers, busy labeling, missed that these heroines teach audiences to expect women to act, not wait. If your feet wander east toward Sulawesi, the Bugis world opens the pages of Ilagalago. There you meet Witanria Bangwise, and poised a node in a web of births, voyages, and taboos so intricate you can hear the loom counting. Her steadiness reverberates with what you've already learned in kitchens and fields. The feminine is not delicate glass. It's the joint that doesn't squeak. And if the storyteller adds a Bisu priest stepping between worlds, you nod of course. A role that braids genders belongs near the epic's moral architecture. Borneo's river bends bring you Putri Junjung Buai, a princess rising from the foam, with the casual authority of someone who knows the tide schedule by heart. Her arrival often precedes the founding of courts. Again, the pattern, a woman as threshold a kingdom, as the room built beyond her doorway. In the Highlands, Dayak stories paint tattooed girls with charms that bite like dogs' beauty as shield ornament, as oath, while a grandmother's hand still stained from beetle drums, the cadence that says, these are not curiosities, they are reminders. Wear your story where enemies can read it and reconsider. The Thai and Lao world offers a familiar epic with local seasoning, the Ramakien and its cousins. You meet Sita patient and razor bright, and Ben Yakai, whose desires and disguises tangle plots into knots a good weaver would admire. Court dancers later pin these women into measured steps, but the heart of the tales still breathes questions the fire likes you to answer out loud. What is loyalty when tested by rumor? What is cunning when survival is on the line? You don't need a scantron. The village takes oral exams. By now you've noticed the teaching method. These stories don't hand you a chalkboard lesson plan labeled gender studies. They seat you between a rice mortar and a sleeping dog, and let heroines solve things. A Naga bride irrigates a kingdom. A court princess sets impossible conditions rather than accept an unfit match. A warrior mother rides an elephant into memory. A puppet heroine shares tactical real estate with celebrated men without changing her voice to sound like theirs. If you're counting through lines, add this. The tales make room for many kinds of womanhood planter, ruler, trickster, mother, spirit friend. And they leave the door ajar for gender-crossing specialists to walk in without a gasp track. You get one quick, gentle check-in. Which story slid under your skin? The river marriage, the mountain refusal, the elephant charge, the arrow's clean arc in the lamplight. Which one feels like a proverb you needed last year? When someone mistook your quiet for absence, the fire won't force you to say. It just keeps the coals steady while you decide. Some nights, the teller slips in later echoes, names like Tun Fatima of Malacca, whose poise under court tragedy still makes spines straighten, or Queen Poisson of Pagan in Burmese memory, credited with the kind of governance that gardens like order. They aren't pre-colonial myths in every version, but they sit comfortably beside the older heroines. Proof that listeners kept expecting capable women to appear when the plot required competence. When the last ember breaks and small feet get nudged toward sleeping mats, you realize the stories never once asked permission to center women. They were already there, watering fields, bargaining pepper-reading smoke, rewriting endings. The crickets pick the tune back up, and an auntie laughs softly, as if to say, you should have seen that coming, the moment the princess refused the sultan's list. The wind shifts, the drums fade, and you feel the floorboards of the stilt house tilt. New laws arrive on paper. You can't read new gods on ships. You didn't invite new money that smells like nutmeg and gunpowder, and the balance you've been tracing all night slides under your feet like a wet plank. You steady yourself, but the river has changed course before you can point to where. The first current comes with sermons and swords wrapped in silk. Islam spreads along coasts, through trade long before cannons speak, layering Sharia atop Adat, the live village customs that gave women markets, fields, and ritual jobs. In many places, the fit is negotiated in real-time Friday prayers beside bargaining queens, veils appearing, disappearing, reappearing like tides. In Achi, remember those ruling sultanas. After decades of queens, jurists grumble, and elite men decide that God prefers a different signature. The courtroom moves the needle. The harbor keeps humming, but the ink dries in a way that narrows the doorway women once walked through without knocking. You can almost hear the footnote forming custom aloud. Text revised. Move inland and eastward. And another current presses in Confucian family law, revived in Mandarinate schools, and codes that arrive with brush and seal. Vietnam leans harder into patrilineal scripts as exams and genealogies reward male lines. The Gia Long Code will later write the father's hand, large, while older habits, daughters inheriting shares. Mothers steering household property persist in the cracks like volunteer rice sprouting from old patties. A grandmother keeps a key to the chest even as a magistrate stamps a judgment against her claim. Legal language stiffens what village life once handled with a nod. Have you noticed how the moment a clerk appears, trust has to dress up and bring paperwork? And the Europeans come waving civilization like a banner and company like a deed. The Spanish in the lowland Philippines push parish and pueblo together, baptizing with one hand and reorganizing tribute with the other. Babaylan are labeled witches. Some are punished. Others adapt, slipping healing into Marian devotions and threading saint days into farm calendars. In the Dutch sphere, the VOC turns pepper and cloves into ledgers, and ADAT once oxygen gets pinned into native law, cataloged, ranked, and selectively enforced. British hands run tin and rubber through Malaya French pens, draft Indo-Chinese codes. In each column, women's property rights thin where a clerk doesn't see them, and market queens find permits and taxes placed just so. If you've ever had an app, redesign, hide the button you use every day, you know the feeling. Except this redesign holds your patty in escrow. The economy tilts. Cash crops, sugar coffee, tobacco, later rubber demand schedules that ignore monsoons and ignore women's rituals that once timed planting with moon and tide. Wage labor calls men away to mines and plantations. Household wealth pivots from jars of rice and gold bangles, liquid controllable to pay slips, and store credit, traceable, taxable. A woman who anchored a family by controlling granaries now watches wealth circulate through company stores. Yes, she still stretches coins like rice into kanji, but profit leaves the village faster than gossip. Have you ever tried to negotiate with a company policy? Try doing it when the manager doesn't live on your river. Schools arrive with bells and benches. Mission classrooms teach girls to read catechisms, embroider samplers, and respect a narrower list of ladylike jobs. Some girls thrive. Letters are power. Others find the curriculum edits their future into smaller shapes. Boys memorize maps where Europe sits too large, and both genders learn that progress sounds suspiciously like someone else's accent. You compare it to an operating system update that promises speed but disables half your favorite functions. Sure, you gain printer. You lose your loom's authority. Dress codes tighten. Modesty becomes measured in inches from collarbone to ankle. In coastal towns, veiling standardizes. In mission towns, blouses and skirts replace breastcloths and sashes. The heat still sweats, but rules override climate. Cloth stops being pure tool and becomes a compliance test. The market lane adapts, of course it does, but the easy modular freedom you admired now has checkpoints. Ask yourself, when fabric has to prove virtue, before it can shade skin, who is choosing comfort and who is choosing for you. Legal codification nibbles at inheritance. In Dutch courts, a judge cites native law to uphold a brother's claim over a sister's, even where her grandmother would have decided otherwise with a snap of fingers. Spanish civil codes reshape Philippine property regimes. French registries in Tonkin and Cochinchina file land under names that fit the form, and if lineage lines kink, the paper flattens them. British Malaya build dual tracks. English common law here, Muslim family law. They're freezing a fluid interplay into institutions that arbitrate without listening to the old terms of compromise. The genius of pre-colonial gender, its negotiated seasonal intelligence hardens into either or. Resistance breathes in the margins. Market women keep setting prices at dawn, even if a tax farmer lurks by noon. Minangkabau Matrilini refuses to fold, sending men Marantau out to trade and study, while the ancestral house stays under a woman's name. Village mediums tuck herbs into saints' bouquets and whisper older invocations beneath hymns. In Java, court ladies commission batik that smuggles descent into pattern. Barang meant for palaces migrates onto shoulders that remember how power used to read. And when colonial wars rumble, women carry messages rice medicine logistics that never make the monument, only the victory. Which job would you pick, the speech or the supply line? Which one wins the day? Even victories come doubled. New education births, journalists, and reformers who argue for women's schooling, for clinics for suffrage, modern words that help women step onto new stages, while the same modernity cages other freedoms. A nurse laughs gently at your village cures and saves a fevered child with quinine. A bureaucrat laughs harder and erases a woman's land because the deed spells her name wrong. Progress is not a ladder here. It's a rotating door, and you have to time your exit. By the late 19th century, photography freezes what theater once let breathe. Postcards show native women as types, tea pickers, dancers, market sellers, queens attendants, frames that entertain metropole parlors while shrinking lives to costumes. You remember the lane where gender walked with its own rhythm and feel the shutter clip it into stills. If someone mailed a photo of your kitchen labeled typical modern woman, how long before you wrote back in red ink? So you ride this last current eyes open. The shadows of change aren't villains in capes. They're policies, sermons, prices, timetables, uniforms. They don't storm the door. They adjust the hinges, and suddenly the room opens only one way. And yet, the old geometry persists in stubborn corners, an ant counting bracelets as